Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISAR.com.
Thanks for downloading the first episode of Season 2 of the Unconventional Soldier podcast. Today, Colin and I are talking to Steve Kiely, who was the HAC, or the Honourable Artillery Company's Chief Instructor from 1999 to 2002, running their patrol selection course. We will cover the contents of the course, some of the changes then and now, a little about the reserve soldier, and some of the background into the HAC. Both Colin and I served as permanent staff instructors with the HAC, so we have some experience of our sister organisation. But before we break into that, as normal, we will start with our guest's military biography, leading up to when they volunteered for the selection course, and for Steve's case, when he joined Reserve Forces. So, Steve, a little bit about you, please.
Thanks very much for that, Kev, and evening, Cole. So I first became aware of the HAC in the early 90s, and I passed the recruits course in 92, and then went from there on to what was called the Battle Selection Course. It used to be called BSc. And then from there, I went into 2 squadron. At that time, the HAC had 3 patrol squadrons that were all in the surveillance and target acquisition OP patrol role. And then I did various things with the regiment through different courses and cadres and exercises. You mentioned on a previous podcast the LERPS school in Vinegarden. I did a LERPS course there. I didn't do the winter one, the Winter Combat and Survival, which was known as Winter Weight Watchers, because everyone came back about 4 stone lighter.
The man's course. The course.
So some people probably said I could have done with that. And then, various bits and bobs. And as you quite rightly said, I instructed on the recruits course, because the HAC at that time, phase 1 recruiting was all done in-house, 100%. And I instructed on that in various guises. Then I was an instructor on the selection course, which by that time had changed its name to Patrol Selection Course. And I was there when the first 473 PSI, Permanent Staff Instructor, was posted to that course. I think before that, Cole, when you were there, you were recruits and guns, weren't you, with the gun troop? And
yeah, that's right, mate. It was a bit of an unknown quantity when 473 got posted down there, and it was quite interesting in that you were very well resourced at the HAC, because each squadron had its own Hereford PSI, which I think were W1. So you had, I think, 3 or 4 Hereford W1s, and you had a Hereford training captain. So I turned up from 473 and was looked at with a bit of scepticism and had to sort of set the ground for the other follow-on instructors. So yeah, I ran a recruits course, and then once we proved our mettle, the guy that followed me, was that you, Kev? I can't remember now. Was it?
No, Chris took over you as a recruits course, because I'm the first official PSI.
Oh, he had to get
the patrol selection course.
So yeah, so we had to sort of prove ourselves and meet the standards that the HAC thought they were looking for at the time.
And to be fair, it was ridiculous it really was the epitome of putting a square peg in a round hole, asking a 473 sergeant to teach drill to recruits, and not doing the patrol soldiering. It was a bit bizarre when you look back. So thank God that was changed, and people saw there was a better fit. So I did that, and then I was back in the squadrons doing various bits and bobs. I became Squadron Sergeant Major of 2 Squadron, and then in 2004 I went on Operation Telic 4. Wrong, Telic 5. I was Telic 5, and that was very interesting for the HAC. So the HAC patrols that have been on 3 and 4 have been part of the Brigade Recce Force, as Kev will know, because I think he met some of them out there in Basra Palace, Kev, I think, wasn't it, when you were out there with them?
Yeah.
But it was the first time that the HAC was part of what became known as Brigade Surveillance Company. So that company was 50% HAC and 50% Welsh Guards. So I was the first company sergeant major from the HAC, I believe, posted on operations since World War II. There'd been troop sergeant majors and things like this before, but the first company sergeant major. So that was I saw that as a privilege and an accolade, and thoroughly enjoyed my almost year with the Welsh Guard contingent as well.
And you've got quite a history with the Guards within the HAC as well, because not only did you have all those Hereford PSIs at the time and the gunner element from 473, and obviously the gun troop had a sergeant from a gun regiment as well. The RSM was a Guards RSM.
Yeah.
And I think the 2IC was Guards and the adjutant was gunner as well. So it was a real mixture of influences.
I mean, I'll talk about this in a minute when I give you a quick 2 minutes on the history of the regiment. But the HAC, even to me, I mean, I was 20 years an HAC man, and even I still look back and think it is the oldest regiment in the British Army, yet it is a curious mix of gunner and household division. The core of drums, wear the blue, red, blue flash, and have the grenade cap. You know, we have the grenade cap badge on forage caps of NCOs and ORs. It's a really weird mixture of the two. But anyway, that was an interesting tour. And then I came back from that, and I was going to leave the regiment, and I kicked about, not doing very much for a thick end of a year. And then they convinced me to go to Sandhurst, do the late entry officer commissioning course. And as a captain, I became OC of the patrol selection course. And I was on patrol selection course for another 2.5 years. And then I finished my time in the regiment as 2IC of 3 Squadron, which at the time was the training squadron. So I officially stepped off from the HAC in 2012. So almost to the day, I'd done 20 years. And during that time, I'd been on ops. You know, I'd done all the courses I wanted to do. I'd soldiered a lot with 473 on exercise, and I've come across them on courses quite a bit. So I was always very keen on the 473 connection, and trying to foster better relations and continuing relations for the benefit of both units, I suppose.
I think that's been reciprocated, because Scott in his pod last time clearly indicated his feelings about that strength of that relationship between the two units.
In fact, it amuses me. Before we were actually deployed to Iraq in 2004, the HAC contingent did the COTAT course down at Lyd. You'll tell me what that abbreviation is. Was it Close Observation, Tactical and Training?
Training Advisory Team, I think.
That's it. Close Observation, Training Advisory Team. So everything to do with static covert observation, wasn't it? So myself and one of the other officers from the HAC, we did the controllers course, so the mission managers course down there, and then the whole HAC contingent came down and did the 4 or 5 week, whatever it was, close observation course. And it was funny because they were very much, and this was alluded to on one of your earlier pods, Cole, they were very much still in post-Northern Ireland phase. The Northern Ireland village, you know, the church had been given a minaret to make it look like a mosque, and a lot of the houses had been painted beige in a very quick and very British Army-esque cheap way of making it go from Belfast or Derry to Basra. And so we were there, and it was very odd because they were still in their Northern Ireland mode, and I used to think that their idea of OPs was almost like covert carpentry. They used to go into bushes with saws and decorators' poles and make these fantastic hides that would make Bill Oddie proud. We sort of looked at them and said, "What do you mean you're not digging? You can't have an OP if you don't dig," because we were all conditioned by that stage. We'd all come through patrol selection course. Or like me, a DS on the patrol selection course with 473. So we were very conditioned to doing things the 473 way, the special OP way. And that led to quite a bit of tension.
And I think that's quite a clash of cultures, really, because on the one hand, you've got Northern Ireland where you couldn't really dig in anyway. There was no sort of NVG threat, night vision goggle threat, or night vision device threat. Whereas in the training that 473 was doing and training the HAC on was for like a conventional war fight, and we had to get underground to survive artillery and small arms fire, cover from view and cover from fire, and also get out of the night vision sort of spectrum.
Yeah, and there were also other subtle differences because they were very much into their overt covert surveillance, i.e. blending in with, not being behind enemy lines, but being amongst the civ pop, and therefore blending in with, the normal troops, for want of a better phrase, whereas we were very much used to you're forward of the line of troops and you're on your own. So, we wore no rank, we wore no badges, we didn't have berets with us, and it was we got used to each other, and we found a way. But instead of one or two of the more seasoned COTAT instructors, instead of referring to us as the bloody stabs, the stupid TA bastards, referred to us as the frickin' 473 wannabes.
Yeah, you can't win in that sort of situation, can you?
Which was which amused me a bit. But anyway, we got through that. But it was funny how in a few short years that 473 influence had gone right through the patrol soldiers of the regiment.
I think there's a good blend of skills to be had there and learning from both theatres, and Kev will know this from his time in Northern Ireland. It wasn't unusual if you're in an SF base, say a vehicle checkpoint in the middle of nowhere, that you'd be booted out of Sanger, one of the watchtowers, for a few days, and some guys from the close observation team,
they'd take
maybe
over.
even 14 in or whatever, I don't know, but they'd come in, you'd be booted out, told to stay away from it, and they'd sit in there and they'd do an overt OP on a task.
Yeah, and that was just a completely alien concept to us. We were just used to being out on our own, and only communicating with other people who are not in your patrol, via your radio. Not normally underground or half underground. So it was it was very strange. But anyway, we got there, and a successful tour, and I think as JD said on a previous pod, the HAC, either on its own or with 473, has pretty much been involved in every Telic and Herrick we've had so far. What I'll do is I'll give you a quick potted history of the Honourable Artillery Company. One thing I should tell you and all the listeners, and you two will know, the regiment is full of pedants who will no doubt pick me up on every single mistake I'm going to make. So with that caveat, this is a very high-level view of the regiment in the last few hundred years. So the HAC, the Honourable Artillery Company, was formed by Royal Charter in 1537 by Henry VIII, thus making it the oldest regiment in the British Army. Some people think that's a bit odd. Artillery in 1537. Back then, artillery didn't mean guns. It meant anyone who fought with a projectile, longbow, crossbow, etc., etc. It was known by various names, but by the end of the 17th century, the 1680s, the Honourable Artillery Company name had stuck. Hedging its bets, as always, we never like to be wrong, so fought on both sides of the Civil War, 1642 to 49. Now, this will no doubt upset some listeners. If you go on Wikipedia, it will tell you that men from the HAC formed the Grenadier Guards in 1656 and the Royal Marines in 1664. Now, there will be guards.
There's a lot of controversy being on this one.
There will be guardsmen and booties absolutely gnashing their teeth at that.
Well, Lee, when the answers come in, when the questions come in, mate, I'll refer them to you.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks very much. I think I'll cut myself off from the world at that point. So the HAC, again, for some listeners may not know, is situated right on the outskirts of the city of London. It's actually in Islington, but it's right by the city, and it defended the city of London during the Gordon riots of 1780. And then things were pretty quiet until First World War. The HAC deployed overseas during the Boer War, just before the First World War, I should say, as infantry, mounted infantry, and field artillery. And those Boer War battles, a number of them, are on the HAC regimental colours. They're the first names, in fact, on the HAC regimental colours. It became part of the TA, the Territorial Army, in the 1907 Territorial and Reserve Forces Act, but the properties and privileges were protected by the 1908 HAC Act. So it's, I don't know if it's the only army regiment that is protected by an Act of Parliament. No doubt someone will have a view on that. But I don't know any others. So in World War I, there were 3 infantry battalions and 7 artillery battalions. 2 VCs were won, both at Gavrelle, and they hang in the medal room at the HAC. And in 1917, an officer training battalion was formed. And then it went back to its sort of territorial role after the First World War. In World War II, the infantry battalion became the 162 HAC Officer Cadet Training Unit of the Reconnaissance Corps. So that's where that infantry battalion just turned into an extension of the other officer training establishments at the time, things like Sandhurst and Woolwich, etc. On the artillery side, 11, 12 and 13 HAC regiments RHA served in Europe and in Africa. There also was a battery protecting various parts of the City of London and on the home front. Post-war, it was set up into an infantry battalion. 1st Regiment HAC Royal Horse Artillery, which was self-propelled artillery. 2nd Regiment anti-aircraft, and a G locating battery. And then there are various things through the 60s and 70s people can look up for themselves. The regiment took its sort of more modern form in 1985, where 1, 2 and 3 squadron were formed, along with HQ squadron and a gun troop, which is how it would have looked when you two fine gentlemen rocked up in the 90s. The gun troop went to liaison troop in 2005. So the gun troop lost its role in gunnery, but then in 2018 it came back as a battery in support of 7 RHA. So all the gun troop, which again I'm going to get crucified for this, but the gun troop, which was always the more sort of how can I say, if you went to the right school, you went to the gun troop. It was more the
Steve.
It went from that to being very wary, and they're now all P Company qualified and para badged. So it's that's gone full circle. In the current role, so when you guys were there and when I was instructing with you, 1, 2 and 3 squadron were all patrol squadrons, and then there was an HQ squadron. A signal squadron was formed, I think, in 94, maybe 95. And then in its current role, that happened in, I think it was, again, 2018. There's the 1 squadron, which is the Special OP squadron, same role as 473 battery. And then 2 and 3 squadron are in the light ISR role. And that's how it stands today.
ISR, Steve?
Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Sorry, I forget with the abbreviation.
And how many patrols are in one squadron, Steve?
Their official manning is 12, but they'll be anywhere between 6 and 8.
I think it's quite interesting as well, that all that history there, because the HAC is a piece of real estate in the centre of London's impressive. It's on the City Road, and when I first got posted down there, I got the tube and I went down there, and you walk along the City Road, and it's quite easy to spot because abutting onto the City Road is this ancient-looking sandstone type. You can tell it's a barracks of some sort, essentially, but it's quite old-looking. But what you don't see from the City Road is when you go through the main gates and you walk into that area of the estate, it's absolutely massive. It's got a cricket pitch, probably enough for 3 rugby pitches on there, Steve, do you reckon?
Well, yeah. Well, officially, there's a rugby pitch, a football pitch, but we don't like to talk about that, and a hockey pitch with a cricket square in the middle.
Yeah, and a massive underground car park for all the vehicles because you don't want them cluttering up the place and making it look untidy.
That's a bit of an anachronism, the underground car park, because I joined shortly after. Well, I joined at the end of the Cold War, right? So again, referencing your earlier podcasts, the regiment had Mexies. They dug in Mexies. That had gone by the time I got there. The first time I saw a Mexi was at the battery lines up at Catterick in the 473 lines, when you had it in that interest room. But when the Cold War was on, the regiment had a lot of kit in Germany ready to go if the balloon went up. And that needed to go somewhere when the first strategic defence review hit after fall of the Berlin Wall and collapse of the Soviet Empire, etc. And they had to find somewhere to put all this gear. So the obvious thing to do was to excavate a massive underground car park underneath those pitches. Now, the funny thing about that is that you will know, Cole, and I think you probably, I don't know if you did or Kev, a lot of the permanent staff instructors live in the flats in the converted houses at the back of that rugby hockey pitch, which is on Bun Hill Row, which is a bastardisation of Bone Hill Row, because that was a plague burial pit where the HAC is. So there was some concern by the environmental health enthusiasts that when they excavated the underground car park, they were going to dig up plague. So every so many metres or something, they used to send someone down with a couple of test tubes and do a bit of testing, bizarrely enough. I think they did dig up a few bones, funnily enough, but no plague. Or maybe they did. Maybe that would explain a lot.
Yeah, some of the strange traditions of the HAC, mate. So, yeah, but if ever anybody goes past it, it's quite a unique place. It is really, there's a lot of money there that vast amount of empty land smack bang the city of London.
I would imagine.
So,
Steve,
Steve,
I'd imagine from a real estate perspective, it's probably the most expensive rugby pitch in the world.
Yeah, good point.
I'm just assuming that. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine it probably is.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on then, Steve, we've talked a bit about the training and all the rest of it. So how's the current reserve course structured, and what are the phases?
So again, I mentioned him earlier on, but JD's went into this in a little bit of detail on the couple of podcasts ago when he was talking about his time in the HAC. So now the HAC sort of semi-run their phase 1 training. So I'll explain. Back in the day when we were doing it, it was a 6-month recruit course. So from raw, you attestation, get your kit, and in you come. It was 6 weekends plus a 9-day final exercise over 6 months. And then you went on to phase 2, which was patrol selection course for those who wanted to do that, which was again 6 weekends and a 9-day, 8 or 9 day final FTX, final test exercise. And for those that didn't want to do that, the patrolling, they could either go to the gun troop or signals and do a signals course, patrol signals or med or whatever. Now, what they do now is they run their internal phase 1 course, where you have your weekends and 1 night a week, learning basic infantry skills. But then you go away on a 2-week final test exercise where you will be with other phase 1 troops. So it's sort of a half in-house, half out of house. And then phase 2 is a signals course with then those that want to join the OP squadron, 1 squadron, then doing the OP course or the patrols course as almost like a phase 3 type thing. And to my knowledge, that is still done in conjunction with 473, at least part of the final test exercises.
That's a long 18 months.
Well, it is, and this is what reserve forces. Anyone listening to this who's either in or has been in or any experience of reserve forces. The problem is you only have a finite amount of time. If you've got a civvy job, then you might only have 2 weeks a year that you can give up for exercises. Outside, when I was on the patrol selection course, either as chief instructor or as the OC, I did 18 weekends a year. So 1 night a week, 18 weekends a year, and then probably about 2.5, maybe 3 weeks of exercise. And the company I work for a bank, they gave me an extra week. But the rest had to come out of my holiday, my 4 or 5 week holiday allowance.
And I don't think people appreciate that sort of dedication. And I certainly didn't until I went down there as a PSI. And, a guy could leave his house on a Friday morning, go into work, and he won't see his family again till late on the Sunday or early on the Sunday
There
evening.
were a couple of times where, my 2 older boys are 20 and 22 now. So they were young children when I was instructing on the selection course, and there were, because I'm at my desk by 7:30 in the morning, and I wouldn't be home till sometimes 7, 8 o'clock at night. There were a couple of 2-week periods where I didn't see him for 2 weeks, because that middle weekend I went to work on a Friday morning and I came home on Sunday night, having been to Brecon or Catterick or somewhere.
And I think the other thing, you've got to be clever when you're a PSI with the reserve forces, because you've got to, your end product's the same, but you've got to treat them, I think, in some respects, and Kev might disagree with me here, but slightly differently, in that you've got to give it a bit of an element of fun, because if you don't, and there's not a lot of fun to be had at 3 o'clock in the morning, the breaking beacons, but you've got to keep that interest going, because if you don't and people lose interest, you'll end up losing somebody. I just wonder what your take on that is, Kev.
Yeah, I think there's a balance to be sought, but I also felt that the people that want to be in the reserve forces and want to give up this time, they want to be pushed. They want to be stretched. They don't want it so easy that they go back on a Monday morning and say, well, I just sat in the field all day and I didn't do anything. They want to tell the story that they did a 10 mile or they did a river crossing or something else. Yeah. So I feel that
and that's what I meant by fun.
Yeah.
I don't mean
yeah. For me, a weekend giving it up, I'm not sure I want to do that. But yeah, it works. It's finding that balance, and I think it's not for everybody either. I think reserve soldiering is not for everybody, and certainly going through a selection course isn't for everybody either.
There's a balance to be had, because what you've got to remember is, if someone wants to leave the reserve forces, then they hand their kit back and they stop turning up. They're not, you can't force them to turn up for you've got to see a year out or whatever. They can literally vote with their feet. So that can be a challenge. And but having said that, I always took the view, and I think the good people do, that you volunteer once. You volunteer when you walk through the gate. After that, everything's compulsory, right? So you volunteer fundamentally to be there, and once you're there, you're there, and you do what you do. You do as you're told.
I think for me, I always had in the back of my mind is that you've always got to remember that you're trying to get to an end product that potentially could go on operations. So you've got to try and get as much stuff into that person as possible in that short period. And if you don't stay on course, don't stay on track, and you drift off and you try and make it a bit more, as it's described to me sometimes, we need to, it has to be sometimes a bit more less serious. That's fine until the day you go on operations and you realise, actually, I wish I'd done more stuff, because we always felt like even the regulars, you always feel like you're underprepared. You want to do more stuff before you go. When you get out on an operation, you always feel like this, bloody hell, I wish I'd done more X, Y, and Z. Well, and I think for reserve forces, it's harder.
I think you're right, but to pick up on something Colin said, training, for it to be enjoyable, it can be challenging. I mean, I don't know anyone who's ever had a gun put to their head and been made to run a marathon. But people do, right? And they look a right state at the end of it. But the pleasure comes from the achievement. And I used to say, in my little speech as OCPSC at the pass-out parade, I used to say, go as far as you can within operational security. Go tell people in the office, tell your family what you've done. Tell them the hardship and how physically hard this is, how mentally hard this is. Tell them what you've done. And when they scratch their head and look at you and say, well, why'd you do it? You look them back and say, because you can't. And that's the reward, right? And the other thing I think with the reserve soldiering is hard is you haven't got time to train people completely. You haven't got time to get people fit. People have to get fit in their own time. You've got time to test them. So I used to say this to the guys: we will test you, but you need to learn in your own time, and you need to get fit in your own time.
That's a great point, actually. And there's more hours of personal time being eroded through that dedication.
Yeah, so you've got to be, out running with your, the weekends that you're not on an army exercise, you're out running with your Bergen on, and I don't know, in the gym or whatever you're doing. But it's interesting when I first joined the regiment, and again, this is my own personal view. I'm sure many people in the regiment will disagree with me, but in the early 90s when I joined, it felt a bit like a private army, Cole. It felt to me like there wasn't much interaction with the rest of the army, and there were too many people who enjoyed saying, oh no, we do things differently here.
I agree with that. I think when I first turned up there and sort of as an outsider looking in, I wouldn't say so much like a private army, but people cut legs off me for saying this, but I'd say it was more of like a private club, and there was a tendency for some to pick the good bits and bend the bits that they didn't want. And then I think from the sort of the mid-90s onwards, the HAC realised it had to carve a new role for itself, and to do that, the mindset had to change. Do you think I'm being a bit harsh there, Steve, or that's a fair comment?
I think you're absolutely spot on. There are three things that changed the HAC for the better. Strategic defence reviews. As Kev often says and used to say, the HAC doesn't have to worry about being disbanded, because it's got this fabulous barracks in the middle of London, and it wines and dines generals, and blah blah blah.
It's got a lot of important contacts and far-reaching places.
It's probably the best networked regiment in the army, but it could always get re-rolled. So if you want to protect your useful role, then you need to get serious. So I think strategic defence reviews, which started chopping the army severely, made the HAC take a look at itself. And again, I think the closer relationship with 473 was the second fundamental thing. Getting closer in training and operations and staff like yourselves. And lastly, it's a matter of timing. Operations. So since 1995, over 300 HAC personnel have served on operations, and that will go through, the Bosnian wars of the mid-90s, Operation Agricola in 99, through Telic and into Herrick. So I think,
and we shouldn't forget, mate, that an HAC soldier paid the ultimate sacrifice on Op Herrick, serving alongside 473 Battery, Trooper Jack Sadler.
Well, when I first joined the regiment, and you guys will know, halfway up the fabulous main staircase is the Book of Remembrance. And if you're in uniform, as you pass that, you salute. You eyes left or eyes right, and you salute. And there are two names on the either side of that now. Two extra names. There's Trooper Jack Sadler, who sadly died in 2007 whilst on operations with 473. And then another chap who went through PSC whilst I was instructing, a guy called Ed Drummond Baxter, a lieutenant, who died in Afghanistan serving with the Gurkhas, but nevertheless was badged HAC before he went to Sandhurst and joined the regular army. So that's a dose of reality right there. Yeah, it's not camping with It's not camping with guns anymore. It's real.
And doing a very real job. So just going back to the selection course that we started off this thread of conversation with, Steve. On your days, what were the average number of recruits that you started off with on a selection course for the actual sort of patrol selection? And what numbers did you end up with on average?
Oh, no, I mean, my own course was probably box standard average. We started actually phase 1 with 72, and then after 6 months, 32 of us passed out as HAC troopers, and then 6 months later, 10 of those passed the selection course. And whilst I was either instructor or OC of the selection course, the largest pass out we had was 19, but that was a double course because of foot and mouth. That was me and Kev, I think, because we missed a course because of foot and mouth. And the smallest was 4. And, when I was first on it, interestingly enough, and just talking to my colleagues who were instructing on the course initially when I was in the squadrons, there would be these debates, is this guy good enough? Or, what do we think of this chap? And, he might be okay. But as soon as Telek and Herrick came along, that changed. Because when I was OC PSC, every single one of my staff had served on a Telek or a Herrick. So you were passing people off to go to places where people were getting shot and blown up. And they had to be good enough. And they were going to be working with the regular army. That was always my massive motivation. I was always terrified of the HAC somehow letting down the regular army. That could never happen. So that was always my big motivation when training people.
And we talked a little bit PT and guys having to train themselves. So JD covered, I think, in the last couple of pods ago about the HAC is more aligned with 473 now and do all the sort of the route marches. In fact, it wasn't who was it described all the route marches in that, Kev? It was Danny, wasn't it? Danny described all the route marches.
Yeah, that's right.
But in your day, Steve, just give an idea to listeners of what the sort of those endurance marches in Brecon that you did as a reservist soldier.
To bring the HAC, the fit, not just the comms and the standard operating procedures, the SOPs, into line with 473, but also to bring the sort of the fitness and the arduous side of it into line with 473. I know this is going to swell his head, but a lot of the credit has to go to the man on the podcast, Kev O'Keefe, because
you can say that all again if you want to.
Because it was an arduous course. Don't get me wrong. 6 weekends. And during those weekends, there would be, you work a week, you might have had the most bastard of a week, you're absolutely shattered. And then on Friday night, you get on a four-tonner or a coach and you go somewhere and you get off and that's it. You're into a night navigational exercise with, whatever currency you use, 50 kilos or over 100 pounds on your back, rifle, blah, 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 and off you go. And until Sunday afternoon, you might only get about 4 or 5 hours sleep. And on that Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, there could be, a 10-mile march involved, or you're at one part of a training area and the pickup is at another part. There is no option but to get on there. So it's always very tough. And then the big test march, which you had to pass to be allowed to go on the final test exercise, was the Brecon March, which essentially was 55 kilometres over the Brecon Beacons in 15 hours. In 15 hours. There could be some adjustments for weather, but that was roughly it. And then the final test exercise, Cole, was very much a 2-phase bit, an OP phase and then an E&E phase with a capture at the end and then what we called at the time resistance to interrogation training. And it was very much, although we'd moved on from Mexis, it was still very much in that mould of we're in Eastern Europe or we're in Western Europe and the Russians have rolled over us. We've sent some messages. The artillery have bombed the buggery out of it, and now we've got to get up and leg it. And it was very much the training was still very much geared to that. But the world had changed, and 473 had seen that. And then Kev made us change it, and he brought in things like we did an 8-miler, but he brought in the 10-miler, which came straight from 473. And Kev, a lot of the soldiers I spoke to, a lot of the students said they found the 10-miler more arduous than the Brecon March.
because remember, we did it at the end of the weekend.
We did it at Otterburn because you started taking us to Catterick and Otterburn. It was, and people that say, the Brecon Beacons is arduous and all the rest of it. Well, I will pay for them to have a weekend in Otterburn.
Well, I chose the routes. I made sure there was a lot of cross graining with your pack on your back. You had to do your OPs, sight your first OP, then you're going to move to another OP. You're going to cross grain again. The idea was to push those soldiers as hard as we could.
But you brought out a good point, Kevin, in an earlier podcast. That 10-miler decided the base fitness and whether people had that base fitness in order to proceed on to the next part of the course. And if they couldn't pass that 10-miler, they didn't have the motivation or the fitness to do that.
Well, you can't be a specialist soldier if you can't achieve something a little bit more than what was the standard training. And that's what we were pushing for. We wanted them to be a little bit fitter, a little bit faster.
Yeah,
not Supermen, but, just that next level.
Yeah, myself, Kev, the course sergeant, the OC of the selection course, we all sat down and it was, we tried to, I'm not saying it wasn't like this before, but we tried to improve it so that each weekend it got incrementally harder. And then really, you never bin anyone, you never fail anyone. It's all self-selection. It's all VW, voluntary withdrawal.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, yes, we go back to that phrase that Kevin and I have used throughout this podcast series. It's the 3 skills that you need to have as patrol soldiers: shoot, move, and communicate.
Yeah.
Shoot in a variety of conditions with a variety of weapon systems.
Yeah.
Move.
Yeah.
On foot and in vehicle, and communicate from hand signals to technical high-speed communications devices.
Don't need anything else.
But that's another thing which, again, to I'm an HAC man and you're a couple of 473ers, but to emphasise the benefits of the cross training. I think I can mention his name because he's been on a podcast. The first person I ever met from 473, I think before even you, Cole, was Lee Chapman, and I met him in the mid-90s. And I think I'd just been made a patrol commander. He was a patrol commander, and there was a 473 patrol on one of our exercises. The one thing I remember learning from him was patrol signalling, comms, because what the 473 boys would do would try and get through, and if you couldn't get through on the radio, instead of giving up and having a sad on, they'd keep trying. But what would happen is they wouldn't stop collecting data. They wouldn't stop collecting intelligence, so that the messages built up. And as soon as there was a window, there would be a flood of messages coming through from them. So, nothing was wasted. And it was little things like that I thought, those guys, they're much better at this than we are.
I always remember being told you don't get communications, you fight for communications. And you didn't get your head down until you had established comms. And your patrol's reputation stood or fell on your ability to get through.
Yeah, it was. Well, there was no point being there if you couldn't tell somebody what you could see.
Yeah. But it
didn't matter how good your OP was, how good soldiering you were, how camouflaged you were. If you couldn't send that one message, what was the point?
But on the training front, though, Cole, I mean, all I've spoken about so far is the benefits of the cross training between the 2 units, etc. But there was some resistance. And there was a lot of inertia, and that wasn't because of any negative view of 473. But as you can imagine, from a regiment in one of the oldest cities in the world, in the oldest regiment in the British Army, it loves tradition and it loves a certain way of doing things. And the patrol selection course up until then had been Brecon based, and the final test exercise was in the Eastnor area. And Kev said, right, we're going to move this to Otterburn, and people spat their pipes out. And monocles fell on the floor, and there was a bit of resistance.
But change, I think, in fairness to HAC, you had your own identity, and you had it for a long time, and no one had tried to change things that dramatically. And probably, I was moving it from where some of the seniors had all been through, so it was their history, and I was moving it, and I was going to change their.
That's a great point, Kev, because in some respects, you turn up, you're a bit of an interloper.
Yeah. I'm there for 2 years.
Yeah.
You're not part of the regiment. You're attached to the regiment for 2 years and you'll be gone. They've been there for 15, 20 years. And their stories, their selection, their training has all been very different. So you saying, we're going to do this, and we're going to bring in a 10-miler and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Why? I didn't have to do it. And it was a little bit of resistance to change, but also I was changing their their version of the history. And some of them would have thought perhaps we were criticising, but we weren't. We're just moving forward because the world had changed and operations had changed. And, just as 473, our selection course had changed many times from the stay behind role through to Gulf War, through to post-Gulf War, we'd be able to fight for our role and redevelop our way of operating. And that's all we would bring in was what we'd gone through.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those changes were a lot more realistic, though, Kev, weren't they? So when I did the patrol selection course and we did the OP phase, we were observing a target area. Let's say it's a junction, a crossroads, and a Land Rover would go along and it would have a number on the top, 28, and you'd look in your book and 28 would be a T-80, main battle tank. So you'd say, right, that's a T-80. And then at night, it would have flashing lights on. What does 2 orange flashing lights mean, followed by a red one? Oh, that means it's towed artillery, and that's the message you'd send back. When Kev came, he managed to get hold of the blow up, the inflatable targets. So there would be a half battery of guns in a wood, on the edge of a wood, and that's a lot easier to miss than a Land Rover with a flashing light. And it just made it a lot more realistic.
And that's all I was trying to do. Because I've been in that position, and so has Colin, where we've watched the Land Rover go past with a number on the side, and you're looking at it thinking, number 6.
Yeah.
And we've done many exercises like that, in international exercises and all the rest of it, exactly the same way. And what I wanted was you turned up and you told people there's going to be a gun position somewhere. No one believes you at the briefings. They're going, yeah, there'll be a gun position. And when they got there was a gun position with someone operating it.
But that perfectly illustrates the fun point I was going to earlier on. I'm not talking about party hats and party poppers. It's like making it an exercise realistic. And by making it realistic, it becomes fun.
Yeah, because then it brings in everything you've been taught. Because like you say, there's no point in seeing it and recognising it if you can't communicate back that that's what you've seen. You had to be proficient at what we called in my day FER, foreign equipment recognition, which, we did the same syllabus as the battery. So you had to recognise what bit of ex-Soviet kit that was, or NATO kit or whatever, and so it made it was a better scenario, and therefore you had more achievements. It was more realistic. I mean, there must be some people in the regiment who think that every time I was connected with PSC or the patrol course, there were changes, because there was the change to the Otterburn area, and that sort of changed the structure of the course. And then a bit later on, when I was OC, and we had a different PSI from 473 battery, who again, another tremendous bloke who went over and above, for considering I'm only here for a couple of years, sort of thing, as Kev said, just went over and above and really cared for the training like it was his regiment and his legacy. And we changed the famous Brecon March, that 55k march, because we found that people were able to get themselves up for that march, pass it, and then just collapse in a heap at the end. And soldiering's not like that. It's about getting a few hours kit, adminning yourself, sorting your feet out, and then doing it again. So we split it in two, into a night march and a day march. So overall, it was slightly longer, but each chunk was smaller than the big march, and that caused a lot of gnashing of teeth. But that sort of send your message and head for Switzerland over the hills. Those days were over. So why did we still do that big Brecon March in one go? Things weren't done just to shake it up. It was done for the purposes of realistic training.
Yeah, you're refocusing on the current role, not just hanging on to the past.
And I think it took an external, like a 473 guy, to force us to do that. You can't do that from within sometimes. You need an external force to do that.
Moving gently on, General Stone, the founder of the Special Observer role, covers some of the characteristics in the first episode with me and Cole, saying that soldiers required the dedication, determination, self-belief, the ability to work in a small team, and self-discipline. Looking at what you completed on the HAC selection and on the training as well, do you think that your selection course and current courses are still seeking the same sort of soldier? And what is the additional attributes required of a reservist to do this?
To a large extent, yes, I agree that you're still looking for those same attributes, because that's the basic building blocks of an efficient soldier. Someone who is physically robust, someone who is, certainly of an OP soldier, someone who is physically robust, someone who is mentally robust, and someone who is relatively intelligent. I think if anything's changed, the kit has become more sophisticated, and maybe there's a level of technical know-how which is required now that wasn't then. But then, having said that, people today, we're three old guys sitting around talking about what it was like in our day.
Two old guys. And me.
They're sort of more au fait with technology than maybe we were. So maybe it's not such a stretch for them. But ultimately, you do need people who can operate in a team and on their own and be relatively self-sufficient. That will never change.
And I think I just want to pick up on a point you made there, Steve. You said patrol soldiers in 473 and the HSE, they need to be intelligent and need to be fit. Now, it's quite easy to get a fit soldier. It's quite easy to get an intelligent soldier. But to get a fit and intelligent soldier can be challenging at times. And again, there'll be people out there going, I'll do one, whatever. But I do think that combination of fitness and intelligence can be quite elusive at times. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Oh, absolutely. And let's mention one other thing, and that is that intelligence and common sense are not necessarily good bedfellows. One doesn't necessarily lead to the other. In fact, often the opposite is true. Two quick stories. I remember we had a lecture from a couple of guys from Pathfinders, a couple of paras one evening, and I was sort of looking after them and was told to take them across to the bar afterwards and look after them. And as we were walking across to the bar, and some listeners may not know that, like a lot of small units, the HAC is very much a first name term sort of unit. We have one mess. There's no officers and ORs. It's all one bar. When we're on parade and there are seniors around, we know how to play the game. But I remember one guy turned to his mate and said, better put your beret on, Dave, because the way they talk around here, you never know whether one of these bastards is a corporal or a brigadier. So that was often a challenge in the HAC. And then back to that time on the Kotak course, I was sitting there when I did the controllers course. We were actually with some grenadiers who were going out to Bosnia, and I was sitting in the control room, and a grenadier patrol turned up, and their controller said to them, "Right, chaps, I want you tomorrow morning at this time in this place with this kit." And they all went, "Done," and buggered off. And he'd been telling me earlier on that evening how he envied me because HAC soldiers tended to be more intelligent. And an HAC patrol turned up, and I said to them, "Right, lads, well done. You need to be at this place at this time with this kit." And they said, "Sir." And then one of them stopped and said, "Can I just ask, wouldn't it be better if we..." And then I turned to the grenadier and said, "See what I mean? This is why I have to do it." So it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
And the way you're laughing, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know. I've been there. But to be fair, you get the same sort of thing in 473 because you're not in 473 and like the HAC, you're not going to get guys that are unquestioning of tasks, orders, and the rest of it. You will if you give a dodgy set of orders, you will be called out for it.
Well, I remember there was a guy you mentioned earlier on who was a PSI called Chris, and he talked about this, and he said, "I'll listen to everyone's opinion, but there's only one person making the decision."
Yeah,
and I thought that was spot on. That hit the nail on the head. You can all have your say,
and then a patrol. It's a patrol command.
Yeah. The responsibility and the accountability lies with me.
So during the Cold War, then, Steve, the Cold War era, I mean, 473 from the troops to 73 to 473, we did a huge amount of continuity training, the LERPS courses and some of the other courses, the survival courses that we had to do. And you talked briefly about, obviously, you did a LERP course as well. But what was the requirement for the reserve special observers for their continuation training, their continuation courses?
Well, everyone that passed patrol selection course then went on. You then went into a squadron, and normally, you were given a radio. You were like, right, you're the newest member. You have the heaviest bit of kit. There you go. There's it was the Klansman PRC 319. There's that. There's a bunch of batteries. You're carrying that. You've just done the course, so you should be good at signals. Get on with it. But there was a patrol signaller course, which everyone had to go through. And then after that, there were other courses offered, but it wasn't necessarily structured that you did this in year 1, this in year 2, this in year 3. It was if you could do the course, if you had the time, get on and do it. So there was a patrol medics course, which I never did, but I understand was excellent. And used to, you can't do this sort of thing these days because health and safety ruins everything, doesn't it? But they used to do an attachment at London Hospital at Whitechapel in the A&E. And if you want to know how to sew people up, Whitechapel on a Saturday night is not a bad place to be. So you got some proper first-hand experience. And then, if any of the guys were, because again, listeners may not know, because of the catchment area, because the HAC is in the city or on the edge of the city, a lot of its members are have professional jobs, bankers and lawyers and, accountants and surveyors and all the rest of it. But if ever anyone was between jobs, or as we used to call it, on the dole patrol, you'd walk in and you'd say, "You're looking a bit glum. What's wrong?" "Oh, I've just been made redundant." "Great, get on this course." And you'd be sent off on as many courses. You didn't have time to interview for a new job because you were too busy running around a jungle or doing some advanced FER course or something. Go on.
But what are the courses today then? Is that changed, or and there's more structure?
Well, it started to change when you were at the HAC, and then certainly throughout the next sort of 10 years, everyone had to do signals. They brought in OPAC because again that's your bread and butter. So whilst a lot of us did OPAC, that became compulsory. You had to drive. Yeah, because
Sorry, Steve, just jump in. For listeners that might not know, OPAC is Observation Post Assistant, and that's the ability to call in fires like artillery.
Yeah, sorry. So that's your basic artillery course, isn't it? That's your stepping stone. So that became something that you had to get under your belt. And as I say, you had to be able to drive, right? You're no use if you can't get behind the wheel of a Land Rover in an ambush situation or whatever it be. And get yourself out of there. So it's a lot more. It started with, I can't remember, was it called Crewman 2000 or something, Kev?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I had to work on.
It started with that back in the 90s, and then it got more sort of formalised. So I suppose, look, today there's probably less scope to do some interesting things, but soldiering in the Telic and Herrick era has become a lot more serious for reserve forces, and therefore you have to get these basic courses done.
Well, it's great to see the evolution of the HAC over the years. When I first turned up there as a sergeant in 1995, so 26 years ago, and even from then to now, you can see the difference. It's a lot more operationally focused. It's certainly supporting 473 battery on operations, and I think that's the way it should be.
Yeah, and I think as some of the people have gone through, as young troopers, they're now the senior staff in the HAC. You're always going to have more of an operational focus than it was perhaps before, because everyone's been on operational tours, or a majority of them have, and so they understand the importance of good training, good preparation. Yeah,
I mean, I'd echo that, because your life may depend on that bloke over there. So you got to, it's not just enough to know that you can do it. You've got to know that they can do it as well. And I just think it's a more professional organisation than, I'm not to say it wasn't before, but I think it's more professional now than it was, more focused.
Different focus, total different focus from the. I think we can reflect that from the Cold War days when that came away. We had to refocus on a different type of operation, different type of battle, and operate much differently to the old stay behind days.
Yeah.
Anyway, as usual, we'll finish off with Desert Island Ditz, which is the guest picks a favourite military book, a film, and a luxury item. So, Steve, what are your choices for this episode?
So, I did send you in advance my choices, but I'm going to change one of those. So
controversial. Guests don't get to do that normally. I hope it's a good one.
I am. So, I'll start with. I'll start with book. So I'll keep the same book. So I looked at the bookshelf and at some of the Second World War stuff on SOE, etc., which is all good stuff. But actually, you'll think this is boring. The book I'd choose is The Falklands War by the Sunday Times Insight Team. Your double podcast on the Falklands was absolutely superb. I love that. It was Jimmy, was it? The guy that was...
Yeah, Jimmy. He was an outstanding guest, and probably one of the best first-person accounts I've heard of the
because
Falklands.
There was no bravado, there was no gung-ho, but there was telling it how it is. I just thought he absolutely got that balance right. The Falklands War was my first experience of anything army. I don't come from a military family other than wartime service. I was 11 when the Falklands War broke out. And I used to have 2 pictures on my bedroom wall. One was Samantha Fox, and this is when I was a teenager, not now, Kev, obvious. And the other one was a picture of one of the aircraft carriers sailing down the Solent towards the Falklands at the task force with the words above it, "The Empire Strikes Back," and that really was quite evocative for me, the Falklands War. Now, the book by the Sunday Times Insight team is very factual. It's not first-hand, you've got soldiers, etc., giving their stories, but it goes behind the scenes. And there are a lot of interesting stories in there around what the political climate at the time and how much help we actually got from the EU and the Americans, etc., etc. So that would be my book. It's the best 1-volume work on the Falklands.
And interestingly, as we've left Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks, which is essentially a defeat, it could be argued that the Falklands War, though not declared a war, was the last successful conflict fought by a Western army. Yeah,
very much so. And a war, no, we're showing our age now, no drones or anything like that, proper hand-to-hand fighting, closing with the enemy.
It's interesting you say that, Steve, because Kevin and I talked about that with Jimmy, and we said it was a Second World War. You could have lifted that scenario, and it had been Second World War.
Yeah,
no body armor, nothing.
Slightly better guns on the ships. SLRs and jets overhead. Other than that, it could have been 1945. Yeah. Absolutely.
And it was fought in 3 dimensions, 3 battles. There was war on the air, war on the ground, and war at sea.
Yeah.
Never happened again.
It was also, everyone forgets as well, it was probably the last war that we've been involved in. We weren't part of a coalition. That was our war.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually.
British only. There was we're part of a wider coalition, we're part of NATO, whatever. It was a solely, British event.
And I'm prepared to be corrected on this, Kev, but I do believe it's the furthest a country has fought a war from its mainland and won.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that, but no doubt someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that's correct. So there's the book. On the film, and this is the one I'm going to change, Cole, because I watched this film again the other day, purely because I came across it. It's a 2014 film, which depicts an event that happened in 2009 in Helmand, and it's a film called Kajaki, and it tells the story of the Kajaki Dam incident. It was released in 2014, and it was on iPlayer, I think, a year or 2 ago. And you can still get it on iPlayer now. And have you guys seen it? I don't know if you've seen it.
I've seen it.
And the reason why I picked that is because, and there's no direct enemy in that film, and it's not particularly gung-ho. But for me, the situation that was faced by those guys, many of them young guys, and the decision-making that they had to make under those incredible conditions where people are stepping left and right and IEDs are going off.
Do you want to just, for people who might not be aware of the incident, just give a quick scenario discussion there, mate, about what the guys happened?
It's on one of the Herricks, it's Helmand Province, and these guys are para-reg, and they go out on a foot patrol down to a dried-up riverbed, which is dried up because of a big dam called the Kajaki Dam. And unbeknownst to them, what has happened is rains over the years have moved Soviet mines from the 80s, from the 79 to 89 conflict, whenever the Soviets were there, has swept these mines into the bottom of this dried up riverbed, and they go patrolling through it, and one guy steps on an IED and loses a leg, and then someone goes to help him, and I think in the end about 4 or 5 of these end up going off, and it shows some modern soldiering, guys on their belt buckles with bayonets pushing at the ground around them, sort of scrabbling among the dust, trying to find evidence of IEDs around them. At one point, a Chinook comes in to try and rescue them, and the downdraft sets off another one. And it's a desperate, desperate situation. And the heroism showed by those guys to try and get themselves out of there and look after themselves and stop themselves, bleeding out and dying. Especially, there's a guy, Tug Hartley, especially the medic. Incredible. It's almost a shame that the VC has to be awarded for, action with the enemy, because that is just the highest heroism. It's a very evocative film.
I remember watching it almost through the fingers of your hands, because as a former soldier, you just think that is just develops into an utter nightmare scenario, and everything that can go wrong for those guys went wrong. You know, the comms went down. Whoever deployed the helicopter sent a Chinook instead of what eventually rescued them was a Black Hawk with a winch.
That's right, yeah. In fact, the first time I saw it, Cole, I was watching it on an iPad with headphones in on a train. And I think when the second IED went off, I think I jumped half out the seat. And I almost had, people looking at you. I had to stop watching it because it just caught me unawares. Wasn't expecting it. Yeah, very, very good film.
So what's your luxury item?
My luxury item is an homage to the great Kev O'Keefe. My luxury item is a Trangia cooker.
I thought you were going to say a tranny.
good man.
That can be many different things. No, a Trangia cooker, because people would turn up with all sorts of fancy, jet bowls have got their place, don't get me wrong, and MSR whisper lights and peak stoves with their Coleman fuel, which health and safety really should have got a grip of, because I saw some people, with flash burns from those things. But the Trangia with its meths, and it would survive the famous Kev O'Keefe drop test, which was, if anyone thought they had a good bit of kit, a new mug, a new cooker or whatever, Kev would put it through the Kev O'Keefe drop test, which was to lob it about 40 foot into the air over hard standing.
Trangia always worked at the end. You just unbent it, put it back on, worked every time.
A bit bulky, wouldn't work in cold too well, but almost indestructible. I'll give you that.
Well, it's more indestructible than everyone else's cooker.
No, I totally agree, mate.
Yeah. But and it's always good to do it at the beginning of the exercise, so they haven't got there's hexy blocks for them.
So thanks for that, Steve. So it's good to see the
Colin.
Yeah, me next. I was just saying, but it's interesting to see that I know the bar at the HAC was often well used after an exercise on a weekend. So I'm surprised you never went for some port or an exquisite whiskey, Steve. But you went for something very practical.
Yeah.
So my recommendation this week is a book called The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer. And I actually got in a conversation this in one of our social media accounts with a listener, and he said that, talking about books from the 80s, and he mentioned this. And I remember back in the day, it was one of those books that did the rounds of the battery and the battery lines. And originally it was passed off as an autobiography, but this has been disputed over the years, and even the author later admitted to some inaccuracies. So it recounts the war on the Eastern Front as seen through the eyes of a young German soldier, and Sajer was a member of the Grossdeutschland division and saw action from Kursk to Kharkov. So what starts off as a race across the vast Russian steppes turns into an everyday story of survival as the winter descends on them and the change of seasons leaves them exposed because they're so badly equipped for a Russian winter. And as we discussed in the recent pod, the scale of death in this front is hard to comprehend. 5 million casualties on the German side and nearly 9 million on the Soviet side. So it's a brutal with no quarter given, and the book reflects this. And it wasn't unusual, actually. Back in the 1980s, you'd be on like a comms exercise, so a non-tactical exercise, and we used to get in Land Rovers and drive hundreds of k's apart and practice comms in Germany. And I remember one time I was on the edge of a wood, setting up antennas, and we're approached by an old boy who was probably in his 60s at the time, who asked if he could see our kit. And it turned out he was a veteran of the Russian campaign, and he was looking at our kit and marvelling at the sleeping bags and all the rest of it, and telling us how he just slept in blankets, and it wasn't unusual to get up in the middle of the night and find somebody frozen to death next to you. So that's it from me then, really. Kev, what's your choice this week?
My choice is All Quiet on the Western Front.
Classic.
Gosh.
A classic, and it's fiction, but the author, and I'm going to try and pronounce his name, Erich Maria Remarque. I don't know if I've done that right, but I'm sure somebody will tell me. He was a German soldier during the First World War. He changed his name back into a French version. So it's through the eyes of his historical. So all the characters that he wrote about obviously were people that he had seen or met. And he wrote it in 1928, and it was a time when writers in Germany were starting to put pen to paper about the First World War and the failings of the German Empire as it was and still was, which caused a bit of controversy. And then in 1932, obviously they made a film of it, which I think most people have seen. There was a remake of the film. Don't bother watching that one. That's not very good.
That's with John Boy Walton in it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's not the same. It's not the same. You've got to watch the original, 1942. And after that, as the rise of the Nazis, they started to denounce some of the writers and some of the film producers who had made sort of more historically correct films and wrote books about the First World War and some of the issues, the failings of the German hierarchy. And they started making false claims about him, about his family, and eventually he had to go on the run. His books were banned in libraries and in public use, and they were part of when they started burning books in Germany. His books were burnt. He wrote other books as well. He then escaped Germany with his wife, and in 1946 he became an American citizen. But there was a lot of, I think in the 30s, a lot of bad blood about the failings of the First World War, who was responsible for it, and obviously the Nazis had started to rewrite history. But a great book, absolutely.
It's a pacifist novel, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think from the First World War, both sides wrote after the First World War, and people started talking about the horrors of the trenches, the horror stories, and the dreadful waste of life, and the tactics that we didn't use, which was basically get up, walk forward, get shot, and die. All books were pacifist in one way because they were all anti-war, because we'd never had a war on such a scale ever. It was horrific.
I'd agree.
And the Nazis like to keep that myth going. That one of the things that gave rise to Nazis was the fact that there was this myth that they were let down by the government of the day.
The stab in the back theory, wasn't it? They called it.
That's right. Yeah.
There was somehow the heroic chaps at the front were stabbed in the back by those back. Well, what we'll say, Kev, is I read that book when I was 15. And it is one of the 3 most depressing books I've read in my life. I'm not surprised that you chose that. That suits your happy-go-lucky personality, that does.
What the other 2 out of interest?
I tell you what, when I was 15 at school, the English teacher made us read 3 books in that year, and they were the most depressing books ever. Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy.
Oh, my God.
A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, I've read that. That's very depressing. And
then All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, but let's not forget, the schools you went to, we were just glad to get books.
You burnt them not out of ideological reasons, Kev. You burnt them to keep warm.
No, we burnt to stay alive.
And line our shoes with holes in them, Kev.
Yeah, well, that's what lino was for, Colin. Lino was waterproofing. That was pre-Gore-Tex. Lino Gore-Tex, as it usually should be known.
Right. So, Steve, it was great to see you again, mate, and thanks for coming on the pod.
Pleasure's all mine. It's been very, very enjoyable. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, you're welcome, mate. And also, thanks to our listener for the support and continued suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes as normal. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram and Facebook and YouTube. And if you want to send a message to Kev, get out your carrier pigeon. If you've downloaded us from iTunes and like the podcast... or what, Kev?
First class stamp, that's all you need.
If you've downloaded us from iTunes and like the podcast, it would be great if you could leave us a review, or leave us a review anywhere, as long as they're nice ones. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing support and sponsorship to the series and offering technical help through his company ISAR. And for those eligible ex-members of 473, please join the Special Observer Association and support their activities, including marching. Well, we use marching in a very loose term for ex-members of the battery, probably a casual amble at the Cenotaph Parade. And if you want to do that, give us a shout on social media and I'll put you in touch with the person who's organising it. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.